Good morning, everyone. My name is Marlee Sade, and I am the project manager for the Emergency Readiness series. I am a manual wheelchair user with brown eyes and dark curly hair that is in a bun, and my pronouns are she and her. Welcome to the first Emergency Readiness series presentation. I have been talking about this project for over a year now, and I am excited to see it through. We have 14 presentations planned around the topic of emergency readiness for individuals with disabilities. Starting us off is the stages of emergency readiness, presented by Rodney Garrott from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. As the Region 5 Disability Integration Specialist, Rodney provides technical assistance and advisory services to Region 5 emergency managers and community partners on disability integration and coordination. This is done through the development of strategies, tools, and tactics that ensure the access and functional needs of people with disabilities are included in all aspects of disaster planning, response, and recovery. He has led disability-inclusive emergency operations on multiple major disasters across the nation. Rodney has also led exercises, presentations, classes, and workshops on inclusive emergency management and provided input for various regional and national level policies and directives. Before joining FEMA, Rodney worked as a clinical coordinator for group homes serving adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Well, Rodney, before we get started with the presentation, do you mind telling us what all of that means?
Oh, definitely. Really, just kind of speaking of my experience within the disability community, coming out of college in the DC area, worked for Volunteers of America Chesapeake. On two sides. One is a community integration specialist, just working to make sure people have access to as many opportunities and resources to live the most fulfilled life they can. And then gradually progressed in the company and then became a clinical coordinator, managing group homes for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And just, living in the DC area, the DMV, was naturally pulled towards public service and different activities around that, coming from the nonprofit sector, and ended up working for FEMA as a disability integration advisor, deploying across the nation for, hold on really quick, we have the L train going by. I live here in Chicago, so you might hear the train from time to time. Was working as a disability integration advisor, deploying across the nation to federally declared disasters, which I'll explain a little bit as we get into the presentations. And just also on that note, I'm presenting twice. So some of the stuff that I talk about today, we're gonna do some follow-up on my next presentation next month. And so you may hear me hint to that, and that's kind of what we're getting at. But deployed across the nation to a variety of disasters, and then ended up getting this position as the regional disability integration specialist for Region 5, which is from Minnesota, basically the 6 Great Lakes states that I support, from Minnesota all the way over to Michigan. And we'll get into that a little bit more throughout the presentation. And yeah, that's kind of, you did a great job with the introduction. That's kind of where I'm coming from with things. And I'm looking forward to presenting. I've already been working with you guys on a few different projects and was deployed out to Ohio last summer, where a lot of these conversations and connections started. So it's exciting to see, where we're taking things and things just progressing. So it's definitely, I'm privileged to be presenting to you guys and with you, with this group. So I'm excited to be here. And with that, we can kind of get into things. And obviously we need to hit on a few of these webinar etiquette pieces, right?
Yes.
Oh, really quick for the visuals. So I'm a black male, bald, probably should have shaved before the presentation, and I'm wearing a black polo. So really quick for attendees, and I'm just gonna read through this. Typically I don't read through PowerPoints. It can be a little bit belaboring, but attendees will be muted during this webinar. you can use the chat feature in Zoom to post questions and communicate with the host. And mind you, we'll be answering questions as we go, so feel free to ask any questions you have. Obviously, no question's a bad question, and they actually help the flow of the presentation. You know, I don't want to get into robot mode up here, just spilling out information. So questions are definitely welcomed. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post an archive of the webinar on our YouTube channel. Also, go check the FEMA YouTube channel. Got to plug it. The link will be shared via email along with the slide deck and resource page. To view the slide deck and panelists side by side, please refer to the control panel at the bottom of your screen. The more option will bring up a drop list of settings. Click on the side by side mode to see the speaker and slide simultaneously. Callers can use *6 to mute or unmute, and *9 to raise their hand. And we have someone monitoring the chat box, so if you want to go about the phone route or the chat route, you know, we're willing to accommodate either one. And with that, I think it's time to get into the meat of the presentation. I wanted to start really. Appreciate it, Marley. And thanks for the introduction. So I wanted to go ahead and let's go to the next slide, and we'll start with two quick poll questions just to kind of get everyone's brains going, as well as just getting a feel for the audience and where our experience is at and, you know, what we're working with. So here we go. The first question: how many of you know how to get in contact with your county or state emergency management agency? And then the answers are yes, I do know how to get in contact with my local agency, or no, I do not know how to contact my local agency. And as you guys are filling that out, you know, the spirit behind that question is just, that's where we start. We have to know our local, state, county emergency managers and the emergency management process in our state, because every state goes about their business in a slightly different manner. And so that's where it's crucial that as we start this conversation, that needs to be the one of the, I guess, cornerstones, if you will, of what we're doing. And we'll be referring a lot of the activities, a lot of the conversation back to connecting to your local, county, state emergency managers. So it looks as if most of us, go ahead and close this out. Most of us don't know. So what I'm gonna do really quick is, if you guys have pen or paper, and we could possibly put this in the chat as well, I wanted to give you guys the Ohio Emergency Management Agency website really quick. And then on there, I wanted to just make sure you guys know that there's an Ohio County Emergency Management Directory. And in that directory, they provide every county in Ohio, their emergency management agency website, as well as the director of that agency. And so as you hear presentations throughout this series, there's going to be references to your local county and state emergency management and how you can advocate for different things you need, want to see, best practices and proactive improvements that you can provide. So really quick, the Ohio Emergency Management Agency website is E as in egg, M as in mango, A as in apple, .ohio.gov. So that's ema.ohio.gov. So as I mentioned, that'll take you to the Ohio Emergency Management Agency homepage. And if you scroll down to the left, you'll see a section where it has a title in there that says Ohio County Emergency Management Directory. And so you click on that, and it'll pull up a list, so you can obviously look at the counties that we're speaking to. So, you know, Union, Licking, Franklin, excuse me, I'm missing our last county. I actually have it written down somewhere. But
Franklin, Delaware, Union, and Licking
Delaware.
counties.
There we go. Okay, Delaware. Sorry, guys. But so yeah, I wanted you guys to have that, and so make sure you guys lock that in as we go through things, and just keep that as a reference and a resource as we kind of build your understanding of emergency management, as well as how to make the systems and processes work for you and integrate into those types of systems and processes as well. Really quick, I have one more poll question, and then we're going to get into a few of these slides and kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be discussing. So let's get the next poll question up and give you guys a few minutes to answer that. So this question is, have any of you experienced a disaster? The options are yes, I have experienced a disaster, or no, I have not experienced a disaster. So go ahead and answer that for us really quick, and we'll get the ball rolling. We're saying the majority of us haven't experienced a disaster. And so there's two reasons why I'm asking that question. One is for my awareness as a presenter, just to kind of see, you know, where our level is as far as understanding of some of these topics and how in depth we need to go, or maybe, you know, touching on some of the basics before we get too ahead of ourselves, right? Because, you know, as an emergency manager, and you'll probably get this vibe or hear other presenters, you know, say it, you know, this is something that's 24/7 for me. And so a lot of these topics, a lot of these phrases, the language around it is very familiar to me. But however, most people rarely, if ever, experience a disaster, right? But then I would also challenge you guys to consider what a disaster is. So the majority of us said we haven't experienced a disaster. And so I would ask, have you guys ever been through a severe storm? I know Ohio is notorious for storms, especially in springtime. Even different man-made disasters or emergencies that may go on in your county or your cities, right? So I think when we think of a disaster, you automatically think, well, if it wasn't Hurricane Katrina, then, you know, it was just, I can't necessarily consider that a disaster because it wasn't something catastrophic that made the news. However, disasters happen on a daily basis on a small scale and on a large scale as well. I mean, a train derailing on its way through your town could be considered a disaster, especially if there's a variety of hazardous materials or something on that. So you'd be surprised just as you kind of think about, well, you know, there was that one time, you know, and so to that point, you'd be surprised how much experience you do have dealing with disasters and some of those key components and thought processes around being a good emergency manager or being prepared, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these topics, some of these ideas, and these stages of preparedness, most importantly. And so through this presentation I'm giving, we're going to kind of give an overview of emergency management, emergency managers, you know, what that means, what an emergency manager is, the stages of preparedness. I'll provide a quick intro into FEMA, just kind of who we are, what we do, the disability integration piece of things. But as I mentioned, my following presentation in November is going to go more in depth into the FEMA side of things, kind of operations, procedures, policies, different things like that to kind of give you a more robust understanding of my work as well as the work that FEMA does. I also want to just get us familiar with some terms and best practices around accessible emergency management. And so whether you're a citizen in a community, whether you're an emergency manager in a community, it's important to be able to understand accessible emergency management and the role that you play, because everyone has a different role and you have to understand how you fit into the processes and how you can best advocate and also see the things that you need as far as emergency response goes. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get to the next slide. So we have the emergency management overview. We'll start with, I have it saying what is an emergency manager, but I think it'd be better to discuss what is emergency management. And so I got a few definitions I pulled from some of our FEMA web pages. And also on my next presentation, we're going to kind of go in depth with a little bit more materials around FEMA and different things we do, ready.gov, going a little bit more in depth in some of that. But emergency management is the organization and management of resources and responsibilities for dealing with a humanitarian aspect of emergencies. The aim is to reduce the harmful effects of all hazards, including disasters. And we use the phrase all hazards because you naturally think to, okay, was it a storm? Was it a weather-related disaster? But there's a variety of man-made disasters and pandemics, there's all different types of things to consider. So they use the phrase all hazard to be an all-encompassing view on disasters. But so that's kind of the technical jargon for what emergency management is. And pretty much in a nutshell, it's dealing with disaster, chaos, providing resiliency skills and resources and the things that a community is going to need to get back to whatever their new normal is. So that's emergency management. We'll go a little bit more in depth as we get through these slides and into my next presentation. The definition we have for an emergency manager is a professional who is tasked with the responsibility of helping communities and organizations anticipate hazards and vulnerability and undertake measures to more effectively deal with the disaster. So I'm an emergency manager on the federal level working for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. You're also going to be hearing from county, I believe the Franklin County emergency managers are going to be presenting. And so it's a field, as I mentioned earlier, it's really a wide-ranging industry. Emergency management is, I've worked in disability integration. However, there's public sector, private sector, national preparedness, mitigation, resiliency, public assistance, individual assistance. And so you need people to do the work to manage these systems. And so those are the emergency managers. At the local level, you're probably familiar with a lot of first responders, so fire, police. And given this situation, certain leaders and for example, in a school, and I hate to use this example, but we do know that they haven't happened throughout the nation, right? But it's a school shooting. And I know you guys have an active shooter training after this. I think that's the next presentation. The leadership at that school in the heat of the moment becomes the emergency manager, the principals, the teacher, whoever is coordinating the response and reaching out to the proper authorities and doing all these activities. That's emergency management, right? Obviously, we build it out into a whole federal agency and a study and all different things, but at its crux, if you will, that's kind of emergency management, dealing with all of those things that come out after a disaster and managing the response. So this presentation is titled The Stages of Preparedness. And so I wanted to make sure that we talked about what those are. And so pretty much we're going, and we say preparedness, I have a definition for FEMA just because preparedness is a very broad ranging word that can encompass a lot of different activities, right? And so how do we as individuals prepare ourselves? How do the agencies that serve us or the agencies we work for prepare to serve their clientele and, have continuous operations in the face of disasters? All these different things encompass the stages of preparedness. And so what we have are, preparedness, protection, response, recovery, and mitigation. I'm going to quickly go through those and just kind of talk about what that looks like. And I'll provide a definition for preparedness and mitigation because they're at the beginning and ending of that preparedness cycle, if you will, or that emergency response cycle where you gotta, as an emergency manager, sometimes, it's hard to ask yourself, where does preparedness start and mitigation end? And as I go into the definitions, I think you'll kind of see a little bit more what I mean by that, because some preparedness activities could be considered mitigation activities and vice versa. So just starting, you have to start with preparedness. So FEMA, so FEMA, and I'll kind of get into the breakdown, but FEMA and DHS is the department, FEMA is the agency. So DHS and FEMA's definition of preparedness is defined as a continuous cycle of planning, organizing, training, equipping, exercising, evaluating, and taking corrective actions in an effort to ensure effective coordination during incident response. This cycle is one element of a broader national preparedness system to prevent, respond to, and recover from natural disasters, acts of terrorism, and other disasters. So pretty much, I ran through a healthy list of things that fall under preparedness. I mentioned planning, training, organizing, exercises. So that's a lot of different things that can all be done in the spirit of making sure a community, a county, a state, a region, a nation is as prepared as possible to deal with whatever may come next. That all hazard approach. I mean, obviously you can prepare specifically for what you're going to see, but you may not know, what the future has. I don't think we planned for 2020 to be the year that it is. And so that's a good example of preparedness. The nation, our region, our states, counties should have had, and most do have, pandemic preparedness or pandemic plans in place. And so we had to enact those. Now, had they been practiced and exercised? Yes. Had they actually had to use them? Some did, some haven't. And so now we're seeing the benefits of preparedness, And so if you didn't put any of those steps in place, we would have, what is an ugly situation could have been even more so, right? And so that's why you have to prepare. Protection is pretty straightforward. Protection is kind of what we're looking at in those moments before, those hours, those days, whether it's sandbagging the side of a river that's getting ready to flood, whether it's boarding up homes before a hurricane hits. These are protection measures that we're thinking of that go into those stages of preparedness. Then of course there's the response. So whatever the disaster was, maybe it's a storm, maybe it's a flood, tornado. For example, the tornadoes that went through the southwest side of Ohio last year, there's the response effort. So now your local, and obviously we're going to talk a little bit more, but now these local and community response programs, initiatives, whether it's first responders, whether it's your neighbors, whatever the case may be, people are starting to take on those response activities, making sure people are health, life, safety is being sustained. Then there's going to be recovery. There's that initial recovery, that whether that's getting people into shelters and getting people evacuated, those type of recovery efforts. And then there's also long-term recovery, which may be disaster case management. It may look like helping people get back to those programs and services that they had available to them before disaster and trying to get those reestablished. Those are more long-term recovery efforts and another stage in preparedness. And then we get to mitigation. So as I mentioned, mitigation and preparedness, it's kind of like, where does one end? Where does one begin? So the definition for hazard mitigation, and I'll give some examples of hazard mitigation versus preparedness here in a second, but the definition of hazard mitigation is to reduce loss of life and property by minimizing impact of a disaster, which the same could be said for preparedness. This begins with state, tribal, and local governments identifying natural disaster risk and vulnerabilities that are common in their area. For example, in Ohio, tornadoes, summer storms, different things of that nature. Those are common to the area, and taking considerations to mitigate those. So after identifying these risks, they develop long-term strategies for protecting people and property from similar future events. And so that's kind of what separates preparedness and mitigation. Mitigation is a little bit more long-term, projecting years, for example, a dam and the impact a dam would have on a community. I mean, that's pretty long-term. That's a really robust build out for preparedness. And so that's kind of where mitigation and preparedness differ. So mitigation plans are key to breaking the cycle of disaster damage, reconstruction, and repeated damage. So a good example of mitigation would be after Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast, well, Superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast, people had to start elevating their homes. The reason they're elevating their homes is because the next time some storm or flooding were to come, the homes are elevated so that now the water flows under the homes, goes back into the ocean. So that mitigation effort reduced the risk of homeowners losing their home again. Some other examples would be if sometimes on the side of the road, you might see what we call riprap or different materials holding pieces of land from if a flood, mudslide, different things like that. And so that's a mitigation effort as well. Another example of one, which is a little bit more programmatic, would be, and something you don't always see, but like a relocation or a buyout of a community. If you had a community, for example, Uh, floodplains. So that's basically, they have maps of the nation that just say where areas are more likely to flood. We call that a flood zone, right? And so you may have a community that maybe 50, 60 years ago wasn't in a flood zone, now is, or has chronically had floods, or whatever the case may be. And it would be more beneficial to the community to relocate, right? Versus have to rebuild every year or every 2 years. And financially, quality of life, all these different things come into play. So that might be an option. That would be an example of mitigation. That's a very long-term type of mitigation effort, right? And then so another one would, yeah, and so I think that kind of gets the gist of some mitigation efforts. I'm not going to go too in detail on that. I'll save some of that for my next presentation. Then we also, so now that we've kind of talked about some of those phases, we're going to talk about the response at a local level. And pretty much what that bullet is just talking to is you have what we call ICS, which is Incident Command Systems. And it just says, Incident Command Structure, which says who's on first, who's on second, who's on third, if you will. And how do we go about delegating responsibility and make sure that we're providing situational awareness at a disaster and making sure we have the right players working on the right issues. So if there's you have a semi-trailer in Franklin County going down the highway and it tips over, has hazardous materials on it, cops are the first on the scene. So the cops are dealing with it. They contact maybe the company. The company reaches out and says, the drivers contacted the company, says, hey, we had a spill. Obviously, you call the police. They're first on the scene. They're managing the situation. Once the company gets involved, most likely they have processes in place for dealing with hazardous material spills because it's probably part of their insurance or a variety of other reasons why they need to have that. Now they're taking over the bulk of the response now that the first responders have made sure, life and safety are managed, and then they're passing that on, and then so on and so on and so on. And so that's a community level example. I also want to give you guys basically city to federal example of how FEMA gets involved to an emergency. So you have the storms in Ohio last summer where there was, I don't know how many tornadoes. I honestly forget the number, something I've never seen before, but there was a variety of tornadoes that came through the southwest of Ohio. The initial response was handled at the city, county level, and pretty much they're doing everything they can do to manage that disaster. As the resources, manpower is overwhelmed by the sheer scope of things, they reach out to the state. So then the state, and there's formal processes in place to reach out to the governor to request declarations and all these things. And we'll talk about that more in the FEMA piece. I'll talk kind of about the whole declaration process, but they reach out to the state asking for more resources. The state turns on the Ohio State Emergency Management Agency resources, staff doing everything they can do to mitigate everything that's going on. As their resources and manpower are overwhelmed, they reach out to the federal government, and then they say, hey, President Trump, we need a declaration to help the citizens because the state is overwhelmed. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources, whatever the case may be. They submit a declaration request, it gets approved. So then the federal response is turned on. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as a variety of federal agencies that have a stake in emergency management that you may not always consider, start to activate their programs and resources and services. For example, the Small Business Administration provides a variety of services around disaster relief and emergency response. And we'll talk a little bit about them in that next bullet, which is sequence of delivery. There's also the USDA. So they have a huge emergency management response piece. And so there's a lot of different federal agencies that have a stake in emergency management. And as things graduate to that federal level, everyone starts to get involved. So that's what we talk about with the response starting at the local level. And similarly, and this is crucial, as you guys look and get a better understanding of emergency management and are starting to see opportunities to advocate or advocate for different resources, approaches, different things needed, or if you're seeing in your community a lack of resources, a lack of accessible services, right, as it relates to emergency management, that local community level is where things start, because ultimately the state, the federal, you know, we are going to go down that chain of command from FEMA to the state, to the county, to the local community, and vice versa. That's kind of the flow of information, the flow of resources and authority. And so, yeah, it's just crucial to remember that as we go through things and as you go through these trainings. And I'm sure as we start to have these other presenters, some of the concepts, some of the things I'm throwing out will start to flesh themselves out as you get more information on this. But I'm also not trying to steal anyone's thunder. I know we have a lot of presenters, so I don't want to touch on just the whole scope of emergency management, right? Let's go into the sequence of delivery. I just wanted to kind of talk about, this is basically FEMA sequence of delivery when we have a, once we get involved with a disaster. So with sequence of delivery, and really quick, can we go to the next slide? I'm not sure if the next slide has, okay, no, it doesn't. All right, so really quick on sequence of delivery, and we'll leave it on this slide. That's fine. So starts with voluntary organizations. And so initially providing these services, so food, water, sheltering, clothing, medical needs, cleanup of debris, all these different things. Oftentimes the first people activated, for example, when you think of United Way, Red Cross, some of these other nonprofits and religious groups that have a huge stake in emergency management, they're oftentimes first boots on the ground providing these services. Team Rubicon is another one. And so those, as far as the sequence of delivery of resources we're talking about, that's kind of the flow of that, right? So the voluntary organizations, they get involved. Then insurance. Insurance is a huge piece of emergency management. I mentioned floodplains earlier. There's flood insurance. There's a variety of emergency management related, disaster related insurance. But so homeowners, renters, and then of course I already mentioned flood insurance. And so that's that next level of resources for recovering from a disaster. You have the voluntary agencies providing those initial life-saving, life-sustaining services, resources, food, water. And then now in that next stage of recovery, you're reaching out to insurance if you have insurance, right? That's in some cases can be considered a luxury. So filing with insurance, getting reimbursed through that. Now, if you don't have insurance, that's where some of these federal partners come into play. FEMA, the Small Business Administration. So FEMA providing temporary housing assistance. And mind you, so those first two stages, the voluntary organizations and the insurance, those are happening before a federal declaration. As I mentioned, the process is for the county, state, federal government getting involved. Those are happening before, during, and after. Then FEMA comes into play, right? So we're providing housing assistance, housing replacement, potentially, repairs, medical needs, dental, in the worst case, funeral expenses, child care services, a variety of funding and programs and services around that become available, as well as the SBA, I mentioned, providing small business administration loans, but then also loans for real and personal property. And basically, real property would just be kind of like real estate, different things, land, oftentimes land's damaged in disasters, and then personal property is pretty straightforward. Now, once people have went through the SBA, registered with FEMA, went through those processes, now you have that application, you have a reference number. Depending on how things go through those processes, then other programs become available. FEMA's Other Needs Assistance Program, as well as SBA disaster funding. And so those help with some of those miscellaneous needs, as well as some of the other issues I mentioned beforehand, help with transportation, group flood insurance, moving and storage, personal property as well. durable medical equipment, things of that nature, medication. Uh, and so those are kind of those initial late stage responses. Then you have long-term recovery, which is, and the voluntary orgs, once again, doing their work, making sure they meet unmet needs. So we went through a variety of those kind of, we'll say those, as far as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So those are, those basic things you need to survive as a human. Once you've got those needs met, there's still those quality of life things that you need, and some needs that weren't met. And so the long-term recovery groups and the voluntary orgs work on the back end of the disaster response to provide a variety of disaster case management services related to that. And so I show you the sequence of delivery just to show you all these moving pieces. And it's crucial that we have agencies and individuals advocating for their needs once throughout this entire process, right? And so making sure you guys are in touch and aware of the voluntary organizations that are working in your community or would be working in your community during a disaster, and being familiar with them, knowing what your insurance looks like. And so we got you guys a PDF that's, it's kind of clunky, but it just kind of talks about the sequence of delivery, and everything I just got through talking about just puts it on paper for you guys to see in a tangible way, just that map of resource response and where it comes, how it comes. And then so with long-term recovery groups and these voluntary orgs with the unmet needs in disaster case management, it is crucial that we have individuals with, so what we refer to, you may hear me use the term access and functional needs. That's kind of, so there's an individual who may have a disability, and then there's an individual who may have access and functional need. Disability straightforward, has legal, language around it. Access and functional needs is a little broader term and encompasses a broader audience naturally, right? And so just to give you some nuance into that, access and functional need could be someone who's a late term pregnancy, but a high risk pregnancy. And so there's certain considerations that individual would have to deal with if there was a disaster, if there was an evacuation, sheltering needs, different things like that. Someone who maybe you broke a leg, and so your leg's in a cast. Now, that's a temporary, mobility concern, but it is a mobility concern. And so that's access and functional needs. It's just kind of more of a catch-all, just to make sure we're encompassing a variety of needs that come with the human experience, right? But it's important that we have people at those tables in these long-term recovery group meetings, and in these different meetings, policies, different things that are going on, to advocate for what you guys need and want. And so I just wanted to kind of paint that picture. So, all right, we're on to the next slide, which is, we're going to talk exactly nothing about us without us. And that's it, simple and plain. So FEMA's mission is pretty straightforward. It's helping people before, during, and after disasters, right? And that it's pretty broad and wide scope for a good reason. There's a lot of moving pieces to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Don't really have time to scratch the surface on the many things that FEMA does in this presentation, but we definitely will get into some of that on the next one. Really quick, just to kind of give that overview of what does FEMA do. We're ensuring resilience to disasters, and that's kind of talking to the mitigation preparedness efforts, right? Disaster response and recovery, that's that disaster deployment right after, whatever hurricane, tornadoes hit, just those activities around that. Preparedness planning, training, and exercise, which is huge. This is in the spirit of that right there, this opportunity to engage with you guys and provide some more awareness around emergency management, and also how you guys can be more active players in the process. Reducing risk from disasters through mitigation. We talked a little bit about mitigation, what that looks like. And that's a big piece of what we do, because as a Federal Emergency Management Agency, we have projects that go on for years. the office for Hurricane Katrina, the field office that operated Hurricane Katrina years and years ago is still in operation. I believe they're just now getting ready to close that down. Hurricane Harvey, for example, operations around that, even though it was 2 years ago, it was hot and heavy in the news. They're going to be working, FEMA's going to be deployed, have people deployed working, supporting that from a financial resource, manpower point of view for years. Puerto Rico as well. And so mitigation is a huge piece of what we do. Working through public and private partnerships at the federal, state, tribal, and local level. Once again, working with the CILs, so the Centers for Independent Living in all the states, and all these partners and agencies, Department of Health, Department of Human Services, and making sure that they have a good understanding of emergency management, how they fit into it, as well as how we have to make sure it's accessible. This is kind of FEMA in a nutshell, their energy that they put towards disability integration and kind of the overview of our approach. So we want to provide guidance, tools, methods, and strategies to integrate and coordinate emergency management efforts to meet the needs of people with disabilities and other access and functional needs. Within FEMA, obviously the states we serve and the regions we serve, and make sure we're providing individual and community preparedness by working with community groups. Once again, this event is a great example of that, and spinning that forward is something that we will be sharing as a best practice. So as I don't know that I mentioned this, but as a regional disability, I did. So the regional disability integration specialist, I serve multiple states. And so some states in the region are more active, more forward leaning as it relates to accessible emergency management, as well as just general citizens and community engagement, as well as service providers and agencies that work within the disability community engaging in emergency management. And so I say that to say, this is a best practice that we can promote into Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, and just give them an example of, hey, the Center for Independent Living in that served these 4 counties in Ohio did this event. Here's what it looked like. Here was the benefits. Here's some of the response. Let's spin this forward to make this a best practice that every Center for Independent Living throughout the region is doing. And just think about the impact that would have on individuals that we serve. So that's kind of the FEMA disability integration approach. Really quick, I also want to kind of touch on, and I'll get more in depth with this on my next presentation, but you have FEMA, because as I'm talking about these different things, I don't want to get anyone lost. So you have FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We have our headquarters in Washington, D.C. In D.C., we have the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination. And that office came out of the Procurement Act, which is Post-Katrina Reform Act, that obviously happened after Hurricane Katrina, where the response was, as far as accessible emergency management, we'll say, lacked, to say the least. And so there was a variety of lawsuits that went into place, and then that act came out. One of the things that came out of that act was the establishment of a disability integration advisor to the administrator of FEMA. FEMA thought that was such a good idea that they built out an entire office around that advisor, who's the director of the Office of Disability Integration, currently Linda Mastandria. So that's at headquarters. And we have the regions, which there's 10 regions throughout the nation. This is Region 5. Ohio's in Region 5. I support Region 5. And my role is at the regional level to, in a sense, mirror the activities of the director of ODIC. As she advises the administrator of FEMA, I'm advising the regional administrator for Region 5, as well as Region 5 staff, and then obviously state counterparts, et cetera, et cetera. Not going to go too in depth with this, because as I mentioned on my next presentation, we're pretty much going to build out all these bullets and really talk about, what does that outreach and community engagement look like? How are we advising, providing technical assistance to FEMA staff to ensure accessibility of FEMA programs and activities? So there's a lot that goes into that. What does that look like? Training and technical assistance to community and state partners, as well as disaster deployments. So I definitely want to get into my deployment to Ohio on the next presentation and what that was like, some of the concerns, some of the best practices, some of the activities around the work we were doing. I definitely think it's good to highlight. And then core advisory group support. We're going to talk heavy about core advisory groups in the next presentation because I think it's really it's a huge piece to the puzzle as far as accessible emergency management, as well as making sure that, as I mentioned, nothing. Well, excuse me, as Marley said, nothing for us without us, right? So these core advisory groups, a great example of a core advisory group is what we put together here, and that's going to kind of be offline. Some of the conversation I'll have with Marley, have with, with Jeremy Morris and some of the folks involved, is how do we keep this group together and build off of this series of webinars and the activities around what you guys are doing at the Center for Independent Living, right? And how we take that and start to build some structures, processes, and plug into the ones already there as it relates to emergency management throughout the state and throughout the counties that we're serving, right? And so that's kind of what core advisory groups look like, or the idea behind that. And so we'll go into more detail in the next presentation, but this is just a brief overview of what I do. So accessible emergency management. Obviously, I mentioned it a few times throughout this presentation. It plays a role in every stage of preparedness. And it's a crucial concept for you guys to understand, but also for you guys to be able to spin forward and see where there can be improvement, whether it's in your day-to-day life and how you can better be prepared or practice accessible emergency management, but then also how you can advocate for the needs and wants of your community at the state, local, county, federal level. So accessible emergency management. A big piece of this is going to be universal design. And so the diagram and the pictures below just kind of paint the picture of what universal design looks like and what those pillars around accessible emergency management are. And so I'll just kind of talk about those and give an example of what's going on here. So you have on the left where it says universal design, you have two different individuals, right? So you have the triangle, you have the circle. Based off their shapes, they both have, and to the left of that, you have the environment that we're trying to basically get them into. It's crucial that the environment fits the needs of both the triangle and the circle, because if it were only one or the other, then there's going to be certain aspects, certain resources, certain programs, certain activities that the other's not going to be able to engage in, right? That's kind of universal design. How do we make it so that the most people can access, whether it's this program, whether it's this facility, whether it's this messaging, communication, how do we make it the most accessible to the largest amount of people? Similar to the all hazards approach we talked about earlier in the presentation, how are we able to provide that universal design so that we can meet everyone's needs? And so with that, you have physical access. So that's taking into consideration how people are going to physically get to a resource, whether we're talking COVID-19 drive-up testing sites, whether we're talking point of distribution for hot meals or meals that are being distributed by a program, physical access to a building. We have disaster recovery centers where basically you have a variety of community resources in one location. And so making sure that that location is accessible so that whether someone has a mobility, vision, go down the list, whatever that disability may be, making sure that they have physical access to any of the programs or locations that might be providing a service. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the cycle of exclusion, and I'm going to be using an example of physical access here in I think a slide or two. So be on the lookout for that. Communication access is another one of those pillars and another consideration for universal design and accessible emergency management. And communication access is could look like a lot of different things. I mean, whether that's alerts for a tornado warning, or whether that's messaging for evacuation needs. A governor's doing a press conference, a local mayor is doing a press conference, making sure that they have ASL interpretation, making sure captioning is available. It's being presented in multiple languages. There's a lot of communication access considerations. And then you put the twist of having to do, obviously, the initial plan for this was for me to be in person. This was going to be an in-person event, and it was just going to have a whole different flavor. We had to adjust, go virtual, and with that came a whole slew of communication access considerations that we had to consider for online presentations, for doing work over the internet, the virtual experience. And so communication access, I get emails weekly, almost every other day, related to communication access now, because there's so much more heightened awareness around it and need for it due to the all virtual or mostly virtual approaches and business operations we're taking due to COVID-19 pandemic. So that's some communication access, just thoughts around that. And then programmatic access, there's a lot of examples we can use for programmatic access. I mean, whether that's an act being put in place, whether it's so I mentioned the disaster recovery centers. So what we've had to do is, because of COVID-19, obviously a disaster recovery center would be a hotbed for spreading the coronavirus. So that obviously would be not a good approach. So what we did is document drop-off centers that were accessible, but were also put in precautions, all those CDC guidelines and different things that have come out around social distancing, PPE, and different things like that. And so that was taking one process, one program, and tweaking it to make sure that it's providing programmatic access and also physical access, but then meeting the needs of the community as well. And so those are just some examples of universal design and what that can look like and how that plays into ultimately us providing accessible emergency management. So talked about accessible emergency management, just kind of want to continue that theme with this slide here, just talking about some of those considerations, right? We talked about communication access, programmatic access, and physical access, and how those could impact some of these different disaster recovery efforts, returning to the community. Are there services available? Programmatic access. Is transportation available? Obviously that would be physical and could be programmatic depending on, what the transportation is doing. And then physical access with the accessible housing. Is it available? I mentioned long-term recovery committees and how crucial it is to make sure that folks within the disability community as well as service providers are engaged with those programs and committees. And that starts with being engaged with your local community and state emergency managers. As I mentioned earlier, we started this presentation with that question because it's going to continue to be a valuable resource. So make sure you guys log that away. Just wanted to highlight this a little bit. I know we're going to talk heavy on preparedness. We have a few different presenters talking about personal preparedness and different things like that. So I just wanted to highlight some of those communication, access concepts, approaches that we mentioned. So you have weather radios, email alerts, text alerts, reverse 911 systems, smartphone applications, television, radio, and internet resources, and making sure that there's communication access being thought about and promoted through all those different lanes for receiving alerts and warnings. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, where I mentioned we were going to talk a little bit about the cascading effects of exclusion. And this just kind of sends home the message of the importance of accessible emergency management and the cascading effects when we don't provide it or it's not provided to the community. So in this example, there is no accessible transportation. There's no physical access to the program. So with that, the person who can't use it. So this individual has a mobility, is using a wheelchair, right? So they cannot bring their wheelchair to the shelter. Then we go to the next issue. Needs more than needs one-on-one assistance. So now you have a shelter manager, shelter staff, resources are starting to be extended over maybe what they had planned for because they're thinking maybe it's no one's going to need one-to-one services or they didn't plan for that. And then we're going into more cascading effects due to not putting in those accessibility considerations beforehand. And simply, if they would have just had accessible transportation, none of this would have become an issue. So as we go down, you see now they have to use more resources, but then also the individual who is not able to bring their durable medical equipment with them is now running into health issues, unable to return to work, et cetera, et cetera. We get down to now how they've got expounding issues off of simply not providing accessible transportation to a shelter. All right, so we've mentioned universal design, talked about accessible emergency management as a practice, and just really frame of mind. And then another thing we have to speak to is the whole community approach, right? So we mentioned all hazards approach or all hazard planning, where you're encompassing everything that could or would go wrong and how we make sure we put plans in place for that. Similarly, the whole community approach is saying, how do we bring in everyone who may be impacted, everyone who may have some perspective or bring something to the table as far as considerations for how we respond to these emergencies, and put forward that all hazard approach, make this the whole community. The idea of that is just saying, let's make sure we're having everyone at the table. So, focusing on enabling participation in emergency management activities from a wider range of players from the private and nonprofit sector, as well as a wide range of individuals, diverse community members, in conjunction with participation of the federal, state, tribal, and local government partners. And then we have a few examples here. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation I do in November, where we're going to be talking about those core advisory groups and how they play into all of this as well. So I just wanted to, as I mentioned, I know we're going to be talking about preparedness, but since I was the first speaker, I figured I'd throw some of them out there just to kind of get that energy going, get you guys thinking about some of these personal preparedness initiatives. I know we talked about the stages of preparedness and just what those processes look like, but just kind of on an individual, everyday level. And then I have a few slides that are going to talk about agency considerations. And what I'd like you guys to do, if you are an agency, then obviously take those into consideration. But if you're an individual who maybe works with an agency, maybe you have an agency that provides you a service, or, you know, whatever the case may be, see if they're doing those things. And if not, make sure you're advocating that, you know, these are some considerations or some things. Hey, have you guys thought about this? Or what are our plans for this? Because I think as a client of any agency, it's your right to know those things and also advocate. And people don't know what they don't know. And so it may be their first time to hear about that, you bringing it up. So I just wanted to get some of those out there as well. Emergency preparedness tips for everyone. I'm not going to read them word for word, but you know, how will you get your emergency information? We talked about accessible communication and considerations around that. How you communicate with your support network. Oftentimes plans aren't put in place for that. All right, so a little on agency preparedness. Every agency should have an emergency plan and ensure the safety of your employees as well as visitors and clients, and what that's going to look like. Oftentimes, and when I was, for example, last summer in Ohio, I was reaching out to a variety of agencies, programs throughout the state to just kind of see what their activities were around their emergency response. And it had been maybe so long, or they had never had any experience with something like this, with I think it was upwards of 12 tornadoes coming through the area, where they were having to do different emergency response efforts and had to provide different services to their clientele and different things like that. So it's important that you have plans in place to meet those needs. So, for example, the Center for Independent Living in the Dayton area, they were having to do wellness checks. And so it's a best practice to have plans in place for, you know, what does that system look like for wellness checks on our clients when there was, you know, an all hazard event. Promoting preparedness among employees, you know, doing exercises, doing trainings, make sure that they're, you know, on their toes, knowing that, hey, we may not see another tornado for another 5 years, but we need to be practicing this every 5 months, right? So just for an example. And then having continuity of operation plans. So Marley, for example, if the Center for Independent Living were to lose power, or you guys were to be hit by a storm, I mean, there's the people you serve still need the services. And so having plans in place to say, okay, well, For example, you guys having to go all virtual. I know you guys started, having to work from home or do different things. And so that's having those continuity of operation plans in place. And so, or simply changing an event from in-person to virtual because that's what was required. So.
You've had both of those occur.
Right. And
yes,
kudos.
We are on the 4th floor of our building and we've had power outages twice, and I'm a wheelchair user. So one, I was trained to roll down the stairs backwards in case I needed to, but I was not trained to be able to handle the fact that the stairwell was not accessible. So I couldn't rotate and proceed down. So we had to call the fire department.
Exactly. I mean, and that's, there probably, can be better plans put in place. And that's where we go into that agency preparedness and just like, you don't know what you don't know until you experience it. And it's just like, okay.
Exactly.
Are there better processes we can put in place? And then, so yeah, that's just always something to keep in mind. Talked a little bit about alerts and warnings on a personal level with communication access. And this is just at that agency level and what they can do as far as passing along emergency information, educating individuals on available resources. This, for example, is huge. I mean, providing the community in a time where there's so many unanswered questions, resources, FaceTime with individuals and emergency managers who can answer questions and speak to issues, talking to the media about accessibility. For you guys may, knock on wood, I hope it doesn't happen in the state of Ohio, but you may see press conferences that aren't accessible. Agencies being able to advocate for their clients and saying, hey, I know we have deaf constituents or people that are hard of hearing. Why don't you guys have captioning available? Why are there not ASL interpreters? Similarly, with evacuations, we kind of just talked a little bit about it, but I mentioned those health and safety checks, the information on evacuations, disability-specific resources, and working with emergency managers. I mean, and Marley, obviously, you can speak to all the connections I'm sure you guys have made through this grant with the emergency management players in the state of Ohio.
Yes, I've tried to connect with all 4 of the agencies within the counties we serve.
Exactly.
Including the health departments.
Right. And yeah, and so in my next presentation also, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff going on in Ohio and some of the departments and activities. And I'm also really excited. I will say this, Ohio, as far as Centers for Independent Living, nonprofits, agencies, disability advocacy groups, Disability Rights Center, just general citizens I've worked with while in Ohio, and the engagement is impressive. As far as just from my regional view, Ohio is really leaning in as far as people looking to get involved in emergency management that maybe hadn't had a thought about it, right? And how we can turn Ohio into a best practice for accessible emergency management. So it starts with the individual citizens, but agencies play a huge role in it as well. So I just wanted to make sure I got some of those tips out for agencies, but then also for individuals to make sure that they're holding their agencies accountable and asking them to do more. We can always do more as it relates to accessibility. Yeah, and so this one just kind of hits on sheltering. I think we have a few other presenters and myself will be going into sheltering a little bit more in detail. So I'm not going to hit on this one too much, but I just wanted to give you some quick overview on some sheltering considerations from that agency perspective and how they can advocate for individuals, best needs. Feel free to reach out. Obviously we talked about kind of that chain of command and flow of resources and information and authority from that local, community, state level. However, not every agency, program, state is as built out as FEMA with its disability integration program. And so there may be opportunities for you to bring things to my awareness, me to be able to provide resources, different things of that nature. So definitely feel free to reach out, and there's my email there. So with that, do we have any questions, comments, concerns, anything you'd like me to, and that's the other thing. So you guys, I'm coming back in November. So if there's anything that wasn't touched on that you'd like to hear more about, I'm grabbing a pen right now so I could take some notes. Let me know.
Yes, guys, feel free to ask any comments, any questions. If you have comments, concerns, let us know. We do have 13 other presentations scheduled. So if it wasn't covered today, hopefully it will be covered in the next presentations.
Okay, we have someone asking about the PDF of the presentation. If I'm not mistaken, it's going to be emailed out to you guys.
Yes, we will provide you with the material after the presentation ends, and it will also be posted on our YouTube page. If there aren't any questions for Rodney, I guess I can give you guys my end statement, and I would like to thank you all for attending the first presentation under the Emergency Readiness series. I hope to see you all on Monday for the Emergency Readiness and Intersectionality presentation, and then on Friday for the politics of emergency funds and how we can advocate on a local level for better policies, better procedures. I would like you also to keep in mind that as you attend these presentations, you will be earning free emergency readiness supplies. You can find that supply list on the flyer, which I will attach to the follow-up email. I would also like to say thank you to Jamie, who is managing our tech. I would like to thank PRI Captioning for their captioning skills. I would also like to thank Rodney for starting us off. We are going to see Rodney again, potentially a couple more times throughout this series, and he will be specifically talking about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who they are and how they can help us. So with that, I would like to thank you guys all again, and don't forget to register to the rest of the presentations, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Appreciate you guys.
Oh, we do have some questions.
Oh, let's go.
How did you get started in this area of work?
That's a great question. That's so. I mean, I'll give you kind of the long story short. Pretty much, one of my friends, they were like, "Hey, I know you do a lot of work with the disability community. FEMA has this cadre. They have this office, and they're looking to hire IM course." I actually, matter of fact, let me see if I can pull up the link for you guys while I'm talking, because I think they're currently hiring for my old position, which was a disability integration advisor. Excuse me.
Believe it or not, guys, my roommate came out the other day and was like, "Marley, do you know about this organization? They're hiring." And it was FEMA. It was that exact position that
Okay. Yeah.
you just mentioned.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I could. You know what? I'll definitely get it to Marley after the fact. Yeah, so I think they're hiring for that position. And let me do a quick plug on two of these things. So how I got involved was a friend, just kind of being in DC and just the nature of the beast, was just like, yeah, you should apply for this job. You're basically just going to be traveling, and working on disability access. And I was just like, wow, especially coming from the group home environment where you see so many glass ceilings for the disability community. So I was just really excited that on a federal level, we can get some things done, right? And ironically, now that I'm on the federal level, I feel like at the state and community level, you can get more. That's another story. So yeah, that's kind of how I got involved, and the rest was history. My first deployment was Hurricane Florence, North Carolina. And I was just like, wow, emergency management. Who knew? Like, I literally had no understanding or experience with it beforehand, except the fact that crisis management. I dealt with the population I served was dually diagnosed as well. So we had intellectual and developmental disabilities as well as a variety of psychiatric diagnoses. So crisis management, I guess you just spin it forward, someone having, a behavior versus a tornado, right? And so there's similar concepts you got to put in place. So that's kind of how it all worked out. But what I was going to say for the quick plug was, and I'm going to get this to Marley just to email out to all you guys, the Office of Civil Rights. So we have the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination, but we also have the Office of Civil Rights, and they have civil rights advisors. And I'm going to talk more about this when I go into my next presentation. But what it is they've started to work more on their the civil rights component of the 504, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And in that, it just talks about government requirements to provide access to programs. And so the Office of Civil Rights has put a heightened focus on their disability access mission as well, and is bringing on more positions, civil rights advisors, and more positions to meet those needs as they kind of work more with the disability community and work more within FEMA on our accessibility from that civil rights law point of view. And I'll talk, like I mentioned, I'm gonna talk more about that on a few of these other presentations, but they're hiring though. So both of those positions, I'm trying to see if I can get, yeah. So I'll, can't pull it up right now just because I gotta see it emails over here, but I'll get that to Marley and get it out to the group for sure.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, and on the next presentation, I'll be sure to have that ready to go in the chat so we can get you guys on board.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So all those topics about durable medical equipment, guys, medications, medical supplies, mental health after a crisis, we're trying to cover our bases here with the series. So I hope to see you all there.
Definitely. Yeah, this is great work you guys are doing. So I mean, the community, I'm not even sure that they know the opportunity they have with all this information. So I'm really proud to see it, and glad to support anything you guys have going on.
All right, and with that, I guess we can all go to lunch. Have a great weekend, and don't forget about the emergency readiness and intersectionality presentation coming up on Monday.